God stepped out on space, and he looked around and he said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. Yes. And God stepped out on space and he looked around and he said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other, and God said, oh, that's good. Then God reached out and took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands till he made the sun, and he set that sun ablazing in the heavens. And the light that was left from making the sun, God gathered it up in a shining ball and flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and the stars. Then down between the darkness and the light, he hurled the world. And God said, that's good. Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand, and the moon was on his left. The stars were clustered about his head, and the earth was under his feet. And God walked, and where he trod, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. Then God stopped, and he looked and he saw that the earth was hot and barren. So God stepped over to the edge of the world, and he spat out the 7 seas. He batted his eyes and the lightnings flashed. He clapped his hands and the thunders rolled and the waters above the earth came down. The cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted and the little red flowers blossomed. The pine tree pointed his finger to the sky and the oak spread out his arms. The lakes cuddled down in the hollows of the ground, and the rivers ran down to the sea. Then God smiled again, and the rainbow appeared and curled itself around his shoulder. And then God raised his arm and he waved his hand over the sea and over the land, and he said, "Bring forth! Bring forth!" And quicker than God could drop his hands, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forests and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, "Oh, that's good." Then God walked around, and God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun, and he looked at his moon, and he looked at his little stars. He looked on his world with all its living things, and God said, "I'm lonely still." Then God sat down on the thigh side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river, he sat down with his head in his hands, and God thought, and he thought, till he thought, "I'll make me a man." Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river, he kneeled him down. And there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the farmost corners of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hands, this great God, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay. till he shaped it in his own image. Then into it, he blew the breath of life. And man became a living soul. Amen. Amen.
Well, good morning. How are ya? What'd you think about that video? That person is actually a friend of mine. Her name is Carmen de Lavalade, and she is quite a famous dancer and just received a Kennedy Center honors this past year. And she is amazing and actually reminds me a lot of Laura Ellen. I wish she was here to see that. But today, we are going to talk about art. So this is Andrews Memorial Baptist Church, and this is where I went to preschool. And this is where the first bit of creativity was killed in me. This church, this preschool, we, of course, did coloring sheets, as you do in preschool. And I, of course, as you do in preschool, colored outside of the lines. And the grade that I got for coloring outside of the lines was a frowny face. I know, isn't that sad? I looked for a picture of me when I was a little kid that was sad, but I couldn't find one, so you just get to look at this beautiful steeple church. So I remember that still. I was probably 3 years old, and I still remember it just like being like, well, what's the point then, you know? And I'm kind of a cynical, stir the pot kind of person. If you know me, then you know that I don't like to play by the rules a lot of the times. So at a cellular level, we're constantly creating new us's. How's that for a transition? At a cellular level, we're constantly creating new us's. You know, we have new cells that are constantly regenerating. It starts from our inception, when the sperm meets the ovary, meiosis and mitosis begin, and it continues through our entire existence. The part of my DNA, the part that's in that cell, and if any of you are like biologist people, and I'm completely butchering this, I'm sorry, just play along. The part of my DNA that helped me enjoy coloring sheets and subsequently drawing and painting and anything else that had to do with kind of a visual art thing was killed at a very, very young age. So existence, what is it? Do you think there's a difference between existing and living? What do you think? Yes? Each week we pray in our offering prayer, and we'll pray this a little bit later, that in our giving, we might give of ourselves so that all may not just survive, but thrive. What does that mean? What does it mean to thrive? What does it mean to live versus exist? Perhaps a way to think about it is to consider what Michelangelo said about this guy. Does anybody know who this is? Yeah, the David. So Michelangelo is, you know, who knows if he really said this or not, but we're going to pretend like he did. It's a famous quote that people said that he said. The greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. So the danger is not in aiming too high and falling short, it's in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. I saw the angel in the marble, and I carved until I set him free. Every block of stone has a statue inside it, and it is the task of the sculptor to discover it. I've actually I've seen this in person, and I was told that someone else actually started working on this piece of marble before Michelangelo did. But Michelangelo was able to come and worked from only an arm's distance. It was covered, hidden behind a cloth around it, and only from an arm's distance. So he did not see this, and he was not able to stand back and look at this until it was complete. He saw inside of this block of marble that angel. So staying alive, what is it? Often in war, one of the first things that is attacked in a country is their art. What is it about art that holds our identity? I'd argue that identity is not, or that art is an expression of our identity, right? It's not just a representation. It's not just a documentation of it. It is our essence expressed. Even the most ancient cultures have left behind art that gives us a glimpse not only into their existence, but their lives. So again, not just their existence, but the way that they lived, what they were about, what they believed, how they interacted, what they loved, how they survived. This picture, which is kind of difficult to see up here, is actually, I'm not even going to attempt to say this because I'll butcher it. But I think the Bimbetka, and I just said I'm not going to attempt it, but Bimbetka and Dharaki Shatan, I think is a location in India. And this is thought to be about 700,000 BCE. So we're 2,000 years AD, and this is 700,000 before that. It's really old. Way before we started thinking about Judaism, way before we started thinking about Christianity or Islam. This is an incredibly old piece of art. It was discovered in 2 ancient quartzite caves, and it not only gives us the insight into these ancient people, but it gives us a point of connection, a realization that humanity has been here for a really, really long time. That even when day-to-day survival was the focus of life, I'm making an assumption here, but they didn't have Netflix to chill and watch and binge whatever shows you watch on Netflix. They were worried about where their next meal was going to come from. So even when day-to-day survival was the focus of life, there was a need and a desire to create. Someone somehow saw it so important that we needed to express ourselves in this simple but very nuanced art. It's really a beautiful thing. So what was it that moved these ancient peoples to create art? What is it that draws our entire world, all of humanity, our species, and even other species into a creative existence? I might even argue that everything that is living is a creative being. One of the ways I like to think about the beginning of the universe is this. The purest existence of love exploded and sent all the energy and matter that ever was and ever will be hurling into space. Particles sent flying through space with all the intention of the paint from Jackson Pollock's wrist and brush, but with the freedom of the paint he flung to become alive and free. These particles bumped into each other, creating glowing balls of gas that dot our night sky, and one that makes our existence possible. Like Pollock, God, the purest existence of love, watched excitedly to see where the paint would land, what the creation would turn into, the perfect balance of intention and free will, and is still watching with love, excitement, and hope as the masterpiece continues to become more alive. That's kind of a telling of the creation story, a very abbreviated version that I wrote. We heard a story from Carmen de Lavallade about the creation. It kind of tells the story of creation from the poem that we find in Genesis in the Bible. And it is a poem. It's not a historical document that someone somehow asked God, how did this happen? And let me write down the factual data. It's a poetic understanding, a relationship that we have with trying to understand our existence in relationship with this divine thing that we cannot wrap our minds around. And what I believe about the Bible is that's what the entire thing is. It's a book of stories, of relating, of trying to figure out how we interact with one another, how this divine love exists in our universe, and why in the world this divine love wants anything to do with us. I believe there's a book of Genesis, there's a book of John, and then there's a book of John Helmier, and there's a book of Natalie, and there's a book of Diana, and a book of Mari, and you're writing it. It's your life. You are just as much a story as the people in the Bible that we see. Somebody at some point decided that we were going to make a beginning and an end to it, and so we have a book that we can carry around. But the essence of it is still continuing. It's still living. And ever since the beginning of time, we've been trying to figure out what we're doing here. And we've been trying to figure out what art is. And Tolstoy took a crack at it by saying this. Sorry if this is small and you can't read it. Art is not, as the metaphysicians say, the manifestation of some mysterious idea of beauty or God. It is not, as the aesthetical physiologists say, a game in which man lets off his excess of stored up energy. It is not the expression of man's emotions by external signs. It is not the production of pleasing objects, and above all, it is not pleasure, but it is a means of union among men, humans, joining them together in the same feelings and indispensable for the life and progress toward well-being of individuals and of humanity. This is much like the genomic expression that, I cannot remember his name right now. A scientist recently, and I can tell you his name later if you care to know, found out that in dying, often, or not often, but there's a small percentage of our cells that come more alive after death. It doesn't make sense. When we die, there are parts of us that become more alive. He found this out by studying the cells and figuring out that it's a weird phenomenon that these cells that have the same genomic information inside of them decide to become a liver or a heart or skin or lungs. What is it that does this? And each one of those cells has a different expression. And sometimes those cells only become most fully alive when we die. It's a bizarre phenomenon. To me, it gets at the fact that we cannot escape being creative, or dare I say, artists. And that in being such, we must notice and call out the artist in our neighbor. Because when we put frowny faces on people's coloring sheets, we're killing the artist within them. We're pushing them towards merely existing rather than living. When our art is stolen, we begin to lose our sense of identity. So what do we do when it feels that the artist within us has been left to die? Well, Thomas Merton says this: art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the very same time. Kind of ponder that for a second. We can find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. Sounds kind of like Easter to me. Art allows us to examine ourselves, to see what we need to lose and what we want to run towards, what we want our lives to be about, what in our lives needs to die so that resurrection can happen either within or around us. This quote is also perhaps one of the most terrifying and frightening things about art. It makes us confront and examine ourselves and what it is within our own being that we love and what we hate. Do you ever remember being in elementary school and writing or drawing or doing some work and someone tried to look at it and you went like this? Did you ever do that? I used to do it. I didn't want people to see what I was doing. I didn't want to be judged on my coloring. Perhaps it came from my frowny faces in preschool. You may also know that I used to be an opera singer in a former life, and I found it much easier to stand on a stage in front of hundreds or thousands of people rather than to sing to a few. What is it about that intimacy that makes it so difficult to be with other people? Is it our culture? I don't know what it is. Are we so critical of others' creations because it makes us feel better about our own insecurities? I know it makes me feel better to sit in an audience and say, oh gosh, that was awful. than it does for me to get up and do something to be the one criticized, right? Are we really just afraid to lose ourselves in service of finding ourselves? Are we really just afraid that in doing so we might fall in love with ourselves and not the idea of who we should be? So, what are the ways that we are creative in the mundane of our lives? But we don't think about it as being art. What do you think? What are the things that we do in our lives in the mundane that are creative, that are art, but we don't name it that? What do you say? Cooking, absolutely. Parenting. Whew, that is an art that I hope I never practice. Just kidding, not really, but kind of kidding. What else? Conversation, absolutely. What else? Getting dressed, yeah. That's an art that's practiced all over the world, right? Not just in the way we dress, but in the aesthetic of beauty. Some cultures think small feet are beautiful, and so they go to these incredibly painful lengths to make their feet small, or their necks long, or hoops in their ears, or their lips. What else? What are the mundane things that are not considered art that actually are? So what was that? Driving, yes. Not many people in Seattle are good at the art of driving. Yes, that is quite true. Yeah. Yeah, what? Absolutely, it's an art. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a dying art, for sure. What was it? Shower singing. Yeah. Listening. Yeah. That is an art that has to be practiced, for sure. Problem solving, teaching, yard work. Yeah. Almost everything we do can be considered art. Have you ever been to someone's house who is a fantastic cook? It's like good art, right? Have you ever been to someone's house who is not a fantastic cook? Or someone who makes the most wonderful cup of coffee? There's one coffee shop in White Center that makes Stumptown coffee, Hairbender Stumptown coffee, and it tastes better than every other Stumptown Hairbender coffee I've ever had. And I don't know what it is, but it's incredible. There's something about the way they do it, the artistry about their coffee. So what does it look like to love ourselves and our creativity? How can we begin to fall more in love with ourselves and the artist that we're called to be? What does that practice look like? What does it look like to understand love as the divine? So what does it look like to understand love as God? If we take a step in loving ourselves, we begin to love the creation we are, and in turn love the divine source from which we all came. We then can begin to love the divine in others. Suddenly, we begin to see the artist in others. We realize that we're all made of cells, made of the same matter, that express the same genetic material in different ways. We can understand that the poem they write to explain their lives, the carving in the cave, the spiritual practice they do, the way they dress, the way they dance, are not something that threatens our existence, but adds more beauty to our collective living. We can then see the artist, whether dormant and awake in our neighbor. We can speak life into that artist. We can appreciate their art without a desire to critique or control it. I'm preaching to myself here. I am a control freak. So we can begin to love ourselves, to love our art, and be okay with our own identity to the point that we don't have to critique or control others' art. We can all of a sudden experience art as love. And we're going to do that in just a moment. We're going to experience the art that Jesus shared with his friends, his closest friends, when he sat at a table in a room with them, and he told a story. He used the artistry of storytelling, of metaphors, to talk about the way he was offering himself. And so as we enter this time of communion, I ask that you might contemplate how you can dive deeper into the identity of your artist and embrace the artistry that you see and call it out in others, and not call it out as a critique or a control, but to say, I see in you the beautiful spark of life that was there from the beginning and will live on and express itself long after. And I think about that a lot today as we celebrate the life of Dr. McKinney. He has died in body, but it's almost as though his spirit is becoming more fully alive. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination this week, and it's almost as though his spirit is more alive today than when he was physically alive on the earth. And as we celebrate the communion of Jesus, the death of Jesus, it's almost as though the spirit of Jesus is more alive today. The artistry of his relationship building, of his subversive political nature, is coming more alive each and every time we meet here together. So I invite you into this time.